Gopi Janabalab Girivardhari Yasoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Jaira Hamadhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ramo, Hare Ramo, Rama Ramo, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Om Vishnupad, Paramhamsa Parvadikacharya, Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada ki, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrindaki, Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Samveda Bhaktivedanta ki, Gaur Premanandi. All glories to the Son of the Lord. Glories to the Son of the Lord. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Agyana Timirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dati Swapadantikam Vandehang Shri Guru Shri Yuta Pada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raguna Tanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Harijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitam Cha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. All right. So today we are on Canto 3, Chapter 12, text 24 and 25. We've got 24 up there. I'll read it and then we'll responsively chant 25. Pulaho nabito yagye pulasya karnayor rishihi angira mukato krishna angira mukato krishno strir maritir manaso bhavat. So here's the translation. Pulasya was generated from the ears, Angira from the mouth, Atri from the eyes, Marichi from the mind, and Pulaha from the navel of Brahma. Now here's the verse we'll do responsibly. Dharmastanad dakshinato Dharmastanad dakshinato Yatra Narayana Svayam Yatra Narayana Svayam Adharma Prishtato Yusman Adharma Prishtato Yasman Mrityur Loka Bhayankaraha Mrityur Loka Bhayankaraha. Dharmastanad Dakshinato Yatra Narayana Svayam Dharma Prishtato Yasman Mrityur Loka Bhayankara. Dharmastanad Dakshinato Yatra Narayana Svayam Adharma Prishtato Yasman Mrityur Loka Bhayankara. Dharmastanad Dakshinato Yatra Narayana Svayam Dharma Prishtato Yasman Mrityur Loka Bhayankara. Ladies. Dharmasthanadakshinato yatra narayana svayam adharma prishtato yasman mrityurloka bhayankaraha. Dharma, religion. Stanat, from the breast. Dakshinataha, on the right side. Yatra, wherein. Narayana, the Supreme Lord. Swayam, personally. Adharma, irreligion. Prishtataha, from the back. Yasmat, from which. Mrityuhu, death. Loka, to the living entity. Bhayam karaha, horrible. So the translation reads, religion was manifest from the breast of Brahma, wherein is seated the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Narayan. And irreligion appeared from his back, where horrible death takes place for the living entity. So I say, and you please repeat. Religion was manifest from the breast of Brahma, wherein is seated the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Narayan. And irreligion appeared from his back, where horrible death takes place for the living entity. Okay, so here's the not translation, but the purport. That religion was manifest from the place where the personality of Godhead is personally situated is very significant, because religion means devotional service to the personality of Godhead, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita, as well as Bhagavatam. In Bhagavad Gita, the last instruction is to give up all other engagements in the name of religion and take shelter of the personality of Godhead. Srimad Bhagavatam also confirms that the highest perfection of religion is that which leads to devotional service of the Lord, unmotivated and unhampered by material impediments. Religion, in its perfect form, is the devotional service of the Lord, and irreligion is just the opposite. The heart is the most important part of the body, whereas the back is the most neglected part. When one is attacked by an enemy, one is apt to endure attacks from the back and protect himself carefully from all attacks on the chest. All types of irreligion spring from the back of Brahma, whereas real religion, the devotional service of the Lord, is generated from the chest, the seat of Narayan. Anything which does not lead to the devotional service of the Lord is irreligion. And anything which leads to devotional service of the Lord is called religion. Dharmastanad dakshinato yatra narayana svayam adharma prishtato yasman mriturloka bhayankaraha. Religion was manifest from the breast of Brahma, wherein is seated the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Narayan. And irreligion appeared from his back, where horrible death takes place for the living entity. We can see that in this verse and in this chapter, as we're churning our way through it, that the depiction of the beginning of filling the universe with population is being discussed. And especially at this point, we see that things are not happening at all according to our modern view of physics, that the way that the whole thing is taking place, Brahma is giving birth from his mind. So this is not our usual way that things happen in our world. And Brahma has such an intelligence, such a mind, that he can generate things with it immediately. And so this first section of chapter 12 up to and including verse, I think, 27, which is 2 verses from this one that we're on this morning, all talk about the creation of the Kumaras, Shiva, and these 10 sages that we've been talking about: Atri, Angira, Brigu, uh, Kardam, Brigu, Daksha, um, Kratu, Pulasya, Pulaha, Marichi, Vashishta, and Narada Muni. So these are 10 sages that are part, and then we'll hear starting from 28 to I think 48, we're going to hear the story about Brahma giving birth to speech, Bak, and then giving birth to the Vedas and Varnashram Dharma, and then the last part from 49 through 50 something or another, the end of it, we'll hear the uh, later types of creation there, how Swayambhuva Manu and his wife Satarupa are generated, and how from them comes further progeny. So Brahma is off to a rough start, as we've been discussing, on creating progeny. He wanted the 4 Kumaras and they refused. He wanted Shiva, and Shiva created beings that started to tear down the universe, and he told him, wait a minute, just forget about that. And now he's generating entities from his very consciousness. So these 10 sages are born from his body, but his body is made of pure intelligence. So it's not a body like our body, it's a different kind of body. And therefore, he's creating these different entities. And eventually, he'll create Shatarupa and Swayambhuva Manu. And then we'll have later on other beings come together and create further progeny. Eventually, Daksha is the one that really makes it all happen, creating his 60 daughters, and then they get given to various sages. And from there on, we get different species of various types. So we here are answering some basic questions of ontology. Ontology is the science or the study in philosophy of what exists and how exactly it exists. What is there? If we're going to talk about reality, what's it made of? We commonly think it's made out of atoms and this and that, but this is all a product of our schooling, what we grew up with. So in philosophy, ontology is this investigation into what actually exists and in what way that it exists. So I was kind of doing a little research into the Greeks, which are considered to be the fountainhead of Western philosophy. And if you look at what the Greeks thought about and what they were up to, you see that it's hard to miss the understanding that they borrowed a lot from Vedic wisdom or from Vedic knowledge in general, because they had their elements: earth, water, fire, air. So already They're getting that from the Vedic system. And then they had this idea of there being an order in the material world, some kind of order. And not only an order, but an order of morality, as one, you know, describer of the Greek philosophy put it, an order of morality. Now, what is an order of morality? It's just another word for what we call karma. You know, that when something is done in the world, it has repercussions socially and for the individual. So if one is doing certain things, violating the order, then one can expect to suffer. And the Greeks talked a lot about that. So, of course, they didn't actually understand very deeply how the material world worked. They didn't have that information. And here in Bhagavatam, we've had these explanations of how from the Pradhan we get to the point of planetary systems, and then Brahma takes it from there, and he begins to get to the stage where he's populating the planetary systems. Where does life come from? You know, that's the big question. And in modern science, that question has many guesswork possibilities. But the Vedas explain that life starts not from amoebas and one-celled organisms bubbling around in the bottom of the ocean somewhere, but it actually starts from the highest living beings that have bodies that are very different from the kind of bodies that we know. And then from there are gradually created different kinds of beings, various sorts. And according the different sorts of beings are created just so that their different karmas can match. You know, we have a certain karma, and then we must have a certain body for that kind of karma. So that's why some people are born in rich families, some in poor families, why some living entities are born as plants or lower animals, others are born as demigods and demigoddesses, and they have control over the material universe. And then there's all the other part of our whole zoo of living entities in the modern world. So what's being talked about here is irreligion, adharma. So Krishna is explaining in Bhagavad Gita, Sarva Dharma Pratyajya Mamekam Sharanam Vrajaham From Sarva Papebhyo Mokshisham Shucha. Prabhupada obliquely quotes that verse in the purport where he explains that one needs to give up all kinds of subtle and not very important religious activity and instead just surrender to Krishna. That's basically what he's saying, because there's all kinds of subordinate. Now, it's explaining that irreligion is born from the backside of Brahma here. And irreligion is adharma, where it's explained that horrible death takes place. And, you know, I was thinking, now what best describes this idea of horrible death? Maybe many things do, but one thing immediately occurred to me, that if we follow Western philosophy up past the Greeks to, you know, past Kant and Hegel and those the German idealists into beginning of the existentialists, you know, we have this whole idea that Nietzsche put forward of God being dead. Now, Nietzsche felt that the Supreme Lord was a concept that modern people could no longer follow. because it was just too crude, too primitive. And therefore, now with God being dead, what's going to replace him? And, Nietzsche said that we have killed God. And what will we do with the blood on our hands? How will we hide that? And of course, he was right in a certain way that in the modern world after World War I and World War II, there was certainly a great feeling that how could God let all this disaster happen, you know? Uh, and this led into the existential movement and so on and so forth. But if one pushes God out of the center, what do you get? You have to put something at the center. So, from the position of science, gradually materialism became the center. And from the position of organization of society, we had great atheistic philosophies develop. Um, the French Revolution was a revolution where humans decided that we wanted to get rid of the Catholic Church, particularly, and religion in general. So the French Revolution changed everything. They put 8 days in a week just so you couldn't tell when Sunday was, because it's a whole different revolution of things. They made 10 months in a year or something like that. They switched everything around. They turned churches into various kinds of other institutions, took all the statues out. Yeah. It was, it was a complete, let's get rid of the old. And they had, Maximilien Robespierre had, this whole idea of having some kind of worshiping a mother goddess or something like that. I forget. It was very bizarre. And it didn't endure, spoiler alert. You don't see that in France today. So it didn't work out in the long run. And of course, the real thing was communism, the whole manifesto by Karl Marx. Of course, the idea of communism was, at least on the surface, it was put forward as a very noble, very, egalitarian movement that we aren't going to have some people, the bourgeoisie up here, getting huge amounts of money and everybody else will be in horrible poverty. So instead, we're going to have the communist setup where everyone will be equal. But as the joke goes, that some were more equal than others, so. And of course, what do you do with the people who are right now, the bourgeoisie, the owners of the land, the owners of the industrial machinery and all that? What are you going to do with them? Well, I guess we have to murder them. It's just one of those problems that you get stuck with, So what do we do? Well, I guess we'll murder them. Okay, that sounds good. That'll get rid of them. And so round them up and shoot them in the head, and then more of them are there, and you have to round those up. Then you have people who might be sympathizers. Well, we better get rid of them too. And then we get talking about people who just aren't on board with this very much. Well, we better round them up too. And so if anything demonstrates what happens when you remove religion, I think this was, the realm of horrible death. Not only did people die, but they died from starvation, they died from torture, they died in gulags, and they died in, various kinds of other horrible situations because we removed God from the center of the picture. Now, what do we put back there? We put man, humans. And what do we put there? These great philosophical ideas. Before we had primitive religion where people had this sense of dharma or sense of some kind of divine retribution. But now we don't need that anymore because we've outgrown it. We've put God, in a shoebox underneath the bed now. We don't need him anymore. So we have our great, idea of evolution. We have our great idea of eugenics, of how we can make things and people better. Our great idea of communism, of how we'll make everybody equal. And now, you know, uh, we have all these ghastly things happening. And of course, um, in Stalinist Russia, this was pretty bad. But the Chinese were not to be outdone. So they've had to do their version of it with Maoist China, where even more people were murdered because, of course, again, you have to get things off on the right foot, and you have to get rid of all those people who disagree and all that kind of stuff. And that's always a little bit messy, but we'll be through that after a while, and we'll only have people left to agree with us because we've nicely murdered off all those who didn't. And again, you have this whole idea of where you have a totalitarian government, a government who is by definition embracing atheism. Both, communist China and communist Russia were both strong proponents of governmental atheism, that there is no God. So when you remove God from the center of the picture, as Nietzsche predicted, then you have this irreligion. And irreligion is the source of all kinds of horrible things. Now you see that, not to be outdone, modern people are trying to figure out if there's a way they can do more than either Mao or Stalin ever thought of doing, with hybridizing humans and robots, and creating a system where we have monitors everywhere, on every street, on every corner, and everyone will have a face recognition system. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, some great computer will be logging up all the details of it and giving you a report card, as they do in China, where if you get enough demerits on your report card, you can't buy things, you can't travel, you can't get a loan. You're really stuck. You got to stay home and watch TV. That's the only thing you can do, So this is what happens when we take the traditional sense of God, even if it's misunderstood, even if God is misunderstood by a culture, it's still better than these cultures that are avowedly, anti-God. And these horrible things take place. So irreligion is kind of the opposite of religion. And knowledge is the opposite of nescience. We have this in the Ishopanishad, that the those we have to study nescience and vidya, or knowledge, side by side. So worse than avidya is culture of so-called knowledge. So what is the difference between ignorance and so-called knowledge? So-called knowledge is detailed knowledge that completely removes the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So what the Vedas consider knowledge to be is whatever you're talking about, eventually you connect it back to the Supreme Lord. You realize it comes from him and it should be done for him. Anukulyena Krishnanushilanam Bhaktir Uttama. That one should serve Krishna favorably and without vestiges of karma jnana, and other things. And in this way, this is considered the highest bhakti. And as Prabhupada puts it in the Vedic uh, uh, purport that he made today, that the highest form of religion is bhakti, is serving the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So the highest knowledge is learning that one needs to serve the Supreme Personality of Godhead. We learn everything's coming from him, everything should go back to him. And if people have that general idea, some will do it more, some will do it less. But then you can have a society where things will be organized and will work. Basically, societies based on the principle that there is no God are, at least in the modern day, are impossible to maintain. They collapse, as the communist society in Russia did, and they transition into another form of course, even in Russia, there was the Orthodox Church, so it wasn't exactly like everybody was an atheist. So you have these kind of things where a society which is not based on the Supreme Lord is a not stable society. It's a society that will eventually crumble in many ways. It will have problems. Now, pleasing the Supreme Lord is kind of the definition of Dharma or religion. If we can please the Supreme Lord, then our lives will be personally satisfying, and a society can be built on that. The whole Roman Empire was about to crumble into different pieces when Constantine discovered Christianity, and he realized that he could keep it from disintegrating if he put a religious principle at the center of it. So Constantine embraced Christianity, even though personally he had never had much interaction with it up to that point, but he made it the state religion. And the Roman Empire went on. Otherwise, it would have disintegrated. It was in the process of disintegrating. So when you remove God from the center, it's like, Krishna says, everything rests on me as pearls are strung on a thread. If you pull the thread out from a string of pearls, what happens? Pearls all cascade onto the ground. So it's the same thing. When you remove the Supreme Lord, then everything starts to disintegrate. And one after another, you can have great politicians, statesmen, scientists, social scientists come up with various elaborate philosophical, socio-economical schemes to put things back together, but it never works. It just creates some new problem, some new situation, but it never actually solves anything, because as long as the Supreme Lord is not in the center, whatever you have is on the railroad track to crumbling and falling apart at some time in the near future. So people say that, Karl Marx thought religion is the opiate of the masses, but religion is not an opiate, and religion is the cure for the disease of selfish desire, which is the actual enemy of everyone and the enemy of a stable society. So today is the appearance day of Vrindavan Das Thakur. I thought I'd say a few words about that, about him. There's not a lot of, at least I didn't find much information about Das. He is the author of the Chaitanya Bhagavat, which is another writing like the Chaitanya Charitamrita. In fact, Krishnadas Kaviraj wrote the Chaitanya Charitamrita just to pick up the pastimes that Vrindavan Das Thakur didn't include, because Vrindavan Das was afraid that his book would become too voluminous. So he kind of skimped on describing some of the Lord's pastimes. And those, the devotees came to Krishnadas Kaviraj, and Krishnadas Kaviraj finished and did more elaborate descriptions on those that Vrindavan Das Thakur didn't do. So Vrindavan Das Thakur wrote the Chaitanya Bhagavat, and when actually he called it the Chaitanya Mangala, but later Lochan Das Thakur also wrote a Chaitanya Mangala. And so Vrindavan Das Thakur decided to change the name of his book to the Chaitanya Bhagavat. And there are many stories of Lord Chaitanya's activities in Chaitanya Bhagavat. Vrindavan Das Thakur is the son of Narayani, who is the niece of Srivas Thakur. So Srivas Thakur's brother is the father of Narayani. And Narayani was a 4-year-old girl when Lord Chaitanya, in the house of Srivas Thakur, kind of out of character. Lord Chaitanya was in the house of Srivas Thakur. The devotees were all around, and Lord Chaitanya climbed up on the Vyasasan, the Nrsingasan, and of Vishnu, and manifested divine form. You know, usually Lord Chaitanya was protesting against people calling him God, but here he actually gave a full representation of himself being God and exhibited different forms, and the devotees worshipped him. So Narayani was 4 years old when this occurred, and we don't know much about her husband because he died very early. Evidently, you know, that even before Vrindavan Das Thakur was born, his father was already deceased, so we don't know much about the father. And he grew up in fairly a great degree of poverty in an area known as Mamgachi. And Vrindavan Das Thakur was educated, and he became very capable. And of course, eventually he went on to write the Chaitanya Bhagavat, which describes Lord Chaitanya, his purpose in appearing, and the divine process of bhakti, which is what we've been talking about. So today is the anniversary of his appearance, Vrindavan Das Thakur. The Chaitanya Bhagavat is quite a lengthy explanation of Lord Chaitanya's activities. And there are some that are the same as in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, seen from a slightly different point of view. But for the most part, they cover different stories, and we learn about all the, different people in the Panchatattva and some of the other characters in Lord Chaitanya's Leelas. So we learn a lot about them. And I'll stop at this point and ask if there are any questions or comments.
Hare Krishna Maharaj, thank you for the class. You spoke about the two different type of governments. One that you gave examples of the French and the Soviet governments that were somewhat atheistical or completely atheistical. And then you juxtaposed it with a religious government, because those governments failed was because they didn't have, when they tried to put something in the center which was temporary. and religion is saved, as you gave the example with the Romans. It saved the Roman Empire for some time.
Mm.
So I was trying to understand. So, is it necessary to have a state government for a state religion for the government to succeed? Like,
Mhm.
so there are examples of other religions, and like, let's say for the U.S. government, it's
Right,
kind of like you religion is allowed, but you can believe whatever you want.
right, right.
So can something like that survive, or does it need to be a single point of devotion that everybody needs to follow?
Well, the idea of there being a single religion is not necessary. You know, it's um, as long as government can be not partial to any one religion, but it can't be advocating atheism. You know, the government actually outright advocates atheism. That government is on the way out. You know, because any way you crack it up, you know, as the Greeks thought, you know, that there is a dharma or a karma. They, you know, they didn't use those words, but if the society itself removes God, if largely the people are atheistic, and the people who are the leaders of that society are atheistic, then that government is on the way to ruin, you know, very soon. Now there can be multiple different varieties of religion, and they can, to some extent, coexist, and that's not going to necessarily crumble. It may take different forms, but it seems that we have this kind of history already, that the least likely to succeed forms of government are those which remove religion altogether. Because as we've been talking about, the principle of Dharma is there. A government doesn't succeed or fail because it implements the right socioeconomic scheme. That's not what makes a government succeed. What makes a government succeed is that it gets the blessings of the Supreme Lord. That's what makes a government succeed. And, you know, I've often thought that in our modern government, if a president or a state, you know, governor just decided to promote religion of any type, you know, he wouldn't even, I would suggest even that he wouldn't have to do it outright, you know, that he would kind of keep that part of it hidden. He would do it and claim to be promoting some socioeconomic scheme, because in our modern political climate, you have to promote some socioeconomic scheme. Otherwise, people think you're nuts, you know, even though they never work, you know, but, you know, if one promoted various different religious groups and, you know, did that, the government would flourish and people would think it was the socioeconomic scheme that was actually causing the upgrade in the happiness and prosperity. And but actually it would be because people are uh, offering prayers and trying to please the supreme personality of Godhead. Some sit here Haritoshanam, you know, and that's, you know, how it could work. You know, maybe in some long, far distant future, the government would come around to one religious organization, and but given Kali Yuga, you know, it seems like we'd have to have a lot of checks and balances in place, because it's so easy for governments to go wrong, and even so easy for religious institutions to go wrong. So that's why, um, you know, Prabhupada did not promote a single, you know, individual to be the king of ISKCON, but rather promoted a group of people, the governing body commission, to uh, collectively come up with programs and with policies, you know. And I think the same thing would have to be there in government. because, but at any rate, it is Kali Yuga, and we're doing the best we can with whatever we have. And governments where religion is allowed and even encouraged to some extent, those kinds of settings will prosper. And organizations or countries where religion is frowned upon, they will, eventually crumble. I mean, there's been so many examples of them on the earth where, um, you know, organizations or governments have tried to, uh, do various atheistic campaigns, and those governments eventually just went belly up. Of course, all governments go belly up, so it's not exclusive. But those governments who particularly embrace atheism go belly up much sooner than any others do. Yeah, Krishna Kripa.
Some people talk about how all the violence that's caused by religion, and they say that, these religious, wars have killed so many people, but you nicely pointed out how the atheists do a much, more better job of killing people.
They do more better violence.
Yeah. So I appreciate that. Thank you. And there, of course, that quote that God is dead is the more one of the more famous of Nietzsche's quotes. But he has another quote that goes, "Without music, life would be a mistake. I would only believe in a God who knew how to dance."
Who said that?
Nietzsche.
Nietzsche said that. Really?
So that's the yes, Kalakanda Prabhu quotes that in one of his books.
Oh, really?
So I was aware of it. So it's amazing that actually Krishna inspired him to say that.
Yeah, right.
He's famous as, Natapal, Guranga, or Vrindavan.
Well, I mean, that's the interesting thing about the Vedic philosophy, that everything is there. In Western religion, we never hear about God dancing. We never hear about him telling jokes. We never hear about God having friends and family and lovers. We never hear about that. And for that reason, God isn't quite so attractive, but see the whole wide spectrum of what the Supreme actually engages in. It's very attractive, and it makes sense. It's full. It's a complete picture. That's the one thing about the Vedas, is that everything is there. All the pieces are there, and it's a full philosophy with all the aspects you need philosophy: ontology, epistemology. You have value theory. You have a system explaining etiology, where everything came from. System explaining eschatology, where everything's going to wind up. Soteriology, how one gets saved. All these aspects are there in the Vedic system, and of course logic, Nyaya, is there too. All these things are they've all been thought out. There's this sense in the modern world that philosophers, scientists, and statesmen are groping for a utopia, a complete picture, but they don't have to grope for one. There's already one existing. They just have to recognize it. And the fact that there is a system of philosophy that does hit all these different points, unlike the modern philosophies. Nietzsche never had all those things, or for that matter, most of the religious systems are void in a few suits. But here in the Vedic system, you've got the entire subject. The whole meal, everything's there.
Reminds me of the person who did the graphics for Sadhaputa's videos, he asked Sadhaputta one time, there's so many far out things in the Vedic literature, how can you accept them? You know, so many supernatural. And Sadhaputta answered immediately, because the Vedic literature can explain so many things. As you're saying, like so many aspects of reality are there in one complete worldview. And nothing else is like that.
Yeah, like when you look at the Greeks, they were really puzzled about so many things. You know, which of the elements is the generator of all the other ones, or is it something else? You know, whether change exists or it's just an illusion. You know, they didn't have that. They didn't have a real moral code really fully fleshed out. They knew some things. You know, Socrates particularly was into morality by his method of questioning people until they got angry with him. You know, so and then you have people like Nietzsche who understand sociology, but they have no understanding at all of the nature of Dharma, you know, or the nature of the human mind. And of course, because he didn't wind up in such a good state, you know. What's that? Yeah, well, Lord Chaitanya only lived to be 48 or whatever it was. But the point is that what kind of person is generated by these philosophical ideas? And we see what kind of people were generated by some of these ideas that were kicking around, you know. Of course, Kierkegaard is considered the proto, you know, existentialist, and then you have Nietzsche, and then you get into this whole really social structure and reinventing, rethinking everything to the point where nothing makes any sense anymore. You know, that's the way our modern philosophies are. You have deconstructionism, and you have decontextualization, and all these other postmodern philosophies, which if you read them, basically all you can find out from these philosophies is what they disagree with. You know, they don't have anything you can agree with. They don't even put forward an agreement. You know, it's like the epitome of jalpa, you know, where you just try to tear down an argument without building up another one, you know, contrary or a, you know, a alternative view. So that's basically what modern philosophies are like. All right, so all glories to the devotees of the Lord, all glories to the Supreme Lord, all glories to Vaishnavas, all glories to Davadas Thakur, all glories to Srimad Bhagavatam. Hare Krishna. I have it's won't stand up yet. You know, I have to do some other kind of adjustment. So I'm thinking about working on it today.